And we are asked to act or align or support or communicate those decisions depending on where you are in the organization. But, before you are in this position, it's always interesting to get that point of view of how were these decisions made? What were the challenges? What were those conversations? And what we have over here is a very diverse panel. We've got Varun, who's a founder of a startup, obviously with a board and a set of investors. You have Tarun, who, Olex is part of a larger holding company, and there's multiple companies in that portfolio. And you've got Karthi, who works with a very well-known board, with a very strong leader, but a large enterprise, right, that's been around for a long time. So that's where we're really going to start, is just go around and find out, what's going on in that room. What was that first discussion that happened a few months ago when you guys were called in? If you guys can give us a little bit of a journey of who were the stakeholders, what were the conversations, what was your response? And if we can kind of focus a little bit on those stories to start, that would be great. And if we can start, I think I initially had, if I'm not wrong, Tarun was going to start? Great.
Thanks, Virginia, for that. I think once we started this journey about a month back, I think it was very important to pivot and decisively move fast in our communication and how we are transparent. So there's a overriding principle and DNA that Naspers had as a holding company, and there were these geography and business owners that collaborated quickly and set forth their priorities. These are not normal times, right? The first priority is to move with speed and decide on where you communicate first, whether it's internally or externally. So our first priority was our internal stakeholders and internal customers, which are our employees. Moving them to a safety net, getting them to work from home before the lockdown hit us, creating forums globally where they could reach out in our workplace ecosystem, because one part is actually working from home, but the psychology of actually being at home for a long time needs a lot of support within the organization and how we can reach out to each other. So we created forums around that, the health safety net that we looked at. So I think the speed of getting our employees safe and in an environment that they can conducively work and support each other was our first priority. And I would not say priority two, but priority in parallel was our customers and our clients and our consumers. How do you communicate in this ecosystem? A large part of our business of Classified is about completing the transaction once you meet each other, right? A large part of our ecosystem is to get jobs for the blue collar folks who are actually, and in this environment as such, people are cutting down on workforce, people are reducing salaries. So how do you support that ecosystem? So our first port of call was to not look at the acquisition side of our business, to look at how we can support our retained customers and clients. So whether it was extending the validity of their Classified subscription, whether it was creating an outplacement cell where ex gratia and for free we were placing people who were losing jobs within the ecosystem. And then you cannot restrict yourself to your community of clients and customers. You went beyond. So whether it was Naspers contributing to the PMO fund, or we at OLX India created an initiative that how can we help the contractual or migrant workers? Can we create a facility where they can be provided food grains and so on and so forth? So it's our existing community of customer and clients and going beyond. That was a priority for that side. The third part is your external communication. In an ecosystem where digital news and news media, the traffic and eyeballs are going through the roof, but most of the things that we hear are on the negative side. What is the absorption rate for our consumers to consume a brand, and in what context, on what priority, and what kind of creatives? Now, for example, our DNA erstwhile was always to have a campaigns around humor. But does humor work in this ecosystem? How are they absorbing it? Even if we do acquire customers, can they transact in the ecosystem rather than solve the problem for them? So, for example, in some of our countries, we quickly pivoted to having delivery facilities so that we can, rather than them meeting each other, we can have that facilitated at their home. And there's safety and hygiene that we facilitated in the whole journey and logistics. Can we facilitate for our clients contactless video interviews? So we created a video tool solution with a third party so that at least for the essentials ecosystem where they were still hiring, they had the pool of resources to come in. So I think these are the ways we kind of pivoted, priority moving from an internal customer to a customers in the market, and the right way to communicate, the ethical way to communicate, and getting a priority straight. So I would say that would be a gist of how we first reacted and continue to react to this phenomenon or this situation called COVID.
That's great. So just one follow-up question on that. Obviously, in a holding company with these first principles around, the employees, the existing customers, and then also being extremely sensitive to what is the right tone and being agile enough to pivot that. Who are the people involved in deciding these first principles, right? So who gets together? How does that filter down into the companies?
So like I said towards the beginning, it's a collaborative decision. While the principle and the ethos and the brand lines and the guidelines of the brand don't change, and they should not change. It's not a short-term ethos that we stand for. But country owners, geography owners, now for example, while in our geography of Poland, we decided to pivot on delivery very quickly because we could facilitate that. In India, we had an issue with that because we didn't have a ecosystem that was already ready for that. So we decided to give back and actually support. So it was a collaboration between the business owners and the board. So the board doesn't come out and say that these are times where we need to save cost in marketing. These are times when we need to have the right context for marketing. These are times where we need to get a priority state. If we are doing that, then who are the people we're reaching out on and what is the objective around that? So it's a collaborative decision.
Collaborative discussion. And obviously, there's so much, like you said, context, right? So these are complicated decisions.
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks so much for that. So let me actually turn over to Karthi to pick up from there, this idea of collaboration with the board on what is right.
Sure.
Obviously, you've spent many years working very closely with the board of Kotak, including, the CEO. Can you share a little bit about how you guys approached when the news first broke, first principles, marketing's response, and stakeholder relationships through this?
Absolutely. Peculiarly for us, I had a personal circumstance which I think colored some of our thinking pretty early on. So I had a daughter who was like many people our age, stuck in the US at college, and Harvard, I think, was the earliest to shut down early March. And then we all started getting anxious about when our colleges were going to give those responses. And my daughter came back as early as the 15th or 16th of March. And as a family, we went into self-quarantine as a abundant precaution right from then. So to start with, there were some titters in the office about the fact that I was effectively taking a free vacation because it was still early days. At that point, it felt like early days. But within a week from then, things started to cascade. And in that week, what I'm actually very heartened with is the fact that all stakeholders, which is independent board members, executive board members, leadership in the context of whether it was HR, CSR, infrastructure, operations, corporate communications, marketing, they all spontaneously came together to say, hey, we got to do something. And here are the ideas that are pouring in from all sides. And again, I think instinctively, everyone's first principle was safety. Safety of customers and safety of employees. So we responded to that first, and particularly because we were painfully aware that we are a utility, that we are going to have to be in service and in operation regardless of whatever else plays out. And this was even before the date of the Janta curfew, which was, I think, 20th of March or whatever it was. The conversations had already started around securing employees. Luckily for us, except for customer-facing people in the branches, many of our functions could actually be dispensed to work from home. So we directed, and all the way from leadership. Again, this is something that people down the system feel very awkward to do. They feel like they're goofing off, and they feel responsible to show up at work even when there's no need to. So I'm very proud of my leadership, all the what we call the General Management Council, which is the second line to the board. They led by example. Uday Kotak and everyone started being at home from pretty much day one and stayed home and are working from home even now. That gave the rest of us a lot of solace and comfort in saying, hey, it's not going to be seen as goofing off, and it's good, and I can do this. So that was the first thing we did. The second line of response was around empathy. So we were conscious of the fact that there were going to be these migrant laborers and daily wage laborers who are going to be rendered unemployed and incomeless immediately. And we have no direct connection with many of these constituencies, but we do, thanks to our CSR interventions, we are in touch with many of these constituencies indirectly through many of our interventions. One of our largest interventions is a operation we run in the slums of Mankhurd in Bombay, where we are essentially supporting practically 100,000 families by helping educate their kids, feed their kids in school, etc. So because schools started to get shut after the lockdown, what we did was we looked at that NGO, and all of our NGOs to see who were going to have to shut operations in their basic work, what of their resources could be redeployed in the context of feeding the hungry immediately. So that was our second thing. Only third, and I would say only about 10% of our energies were around looking at what to do about business impact. And within that, the marketing interventions were around how do we hold our customers' hands? How do we educate customers that 90% of what they do with the bank can be done from home? And we quickly drummed up a large playlist of videos for them to watch on, even if they had not been online yet, and which we're seeing signs of everywhere, right? The adoption to digital has been quite hockey stick right now. We saw that ourselves as well. But insofar as people had resisted doing it, we sent them simple educational material so that they could access that and move them also online, so that we'd limit the crowds in the branches. Within the branches, naturally, like many others have done, we also put in all the social distancing measures. We put in tools to protect our employees as well as protect the customers, etc. And I think, broadly speaking, those were the three lines. Separately, of course, in the CSR context, Uday demonstrated his voice by straight away writing a reasonably chunky check to the PM Cares Fund. Our CSR fund has also contributed. Employees have also been clamoring to support in one way or the other. And we've done a number of things. One of the things we strategically decided to do pretty early on was we saw that a lot of support was going to hospitals and the medical personnel, which was obviously very important. But we saw, for example, again, from a personal context, because my daughter was quarantined, we saw that a doctor and a police officer were visiting our house roughly every 3 days to keep track that she was still healthy, etc. The doctor had a mask, the policeman had a handkerchief. So what we decided to do was to support police personnel across the country as much as we could with all the protective stuff. So we started with masks, we moved on to shields. They reached out to us in a number of cities and said, wherever we hear of a suspect case and we try to go into the suspect areas to try to get this potential patient out, sometimes there's a lot of resistance and the police are at risk personally as well. So they also needed personal protection equipment, which is somewhat non-intuitive, right? Nurses and doctors is obvious, but policemen also should be wearing personal protection equipment, was non-intuitive. So we started supporting that. And the other very simple, very low-hanging fruit is that all the checkposts across the country, these poor people are sitting out in the hot sun. So we did a simple thing of producing these large beach umbrellas, and we've been distributing them in many cities, and we're continuing those efforts. So that's most of what we do, I guess, some of what we're doing at least.
That's great. What I really love about what you described, right? Once the first principles are established, wherever they're inspired from, and when you said safety, the fact that safety then actually became the lens with which you looked at solutions.
Right.
You know, safety for those policemen, safety for your branch workers.
Absolutely.
And so it almost feels like those first principles actually helped you figure out how to activate your resources. And interestingly, that's in different parts of the organization, right?
Sure.
They're individual. So this idea of setting first principles is really, really interesting and powerful. So let me turn over, thank you for that, Karthi, turn over to Varun, right? Same question, you're in the thick of things as startups. We're hearing startups are really struggling. I mentor, a lot of startup founders, and, obviously the other two organizations have, collaboration and a lot of very experienced, smart people. For you, the buck stops with you. So how did you go through that journey?
So I think, yes, I would agree. The big companies or larger groups have the benefit that they're not worried about getting wiped off. Right? In such a black swan event scenario, younger companies, smaller brands, if not managed correctly, and the output can be disastrous, and you can end up not being present at the end of the scenario as a business or as a company. Right? And hence, there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle that we need to sort of take care of. And from a stakeholder perspective, I think we would define our stakeholders as 5 key. And first is our consumers, of course, right? And this is in no particular order. All stakeholders are equally important. And consumers, employees, our suppliers, our customers, and which is the partners through which we sell, and our investors. And that's the stakeholder ecosystem which we are in. And when we are building a plan, we need to take care of how we are managing each of the parts of this ecosystem. Right? From a board perspective, right, I think what I at least learned through this exercise, and is that the board was looking at two or three things. One, they want you to be authentic, right? I don't think any of us know or can certainly say how things are going to shape up. And it's okay for a leader to be vulnerable. It's okay for a manager to be vulnerable at these times and say, hey, I don't know how things will shape up. But I can imagine things can shape up to be in these different ways. And I am prepared for each and every way. And I have a plan for each and every way. And so the second thing that they're basically expecting from you is that you as a leader and your organization is prepared, and they have a plan for different kind of scenarios shaping up. And so I think from a board perspective, that is how we started some of that planning and conversation as a leadership team. And from a first principles perspective, I think we had 4 key first principles that we sort of put in place. And the first was business continuity and safety, and which was about ensuring that our employees are safe. We start sort of working from home. We set up the required infrastructure that employees will need to work from home. Because while as leaders or top managers, you might have everything in place, right? But imagine a young customer service operator who is sharing a PG accommodation, right? Now this person does not even have a Wi-Fi at home, right? And hence you need to think at all breadths and widths when it comes to how to ensure that all your employees are set up to deliver what they need to deliver from home, right? And they're operating safely. And same goes for how our warehouse operations or some of the other pieces where permissions are required sort of get managed. And so the first principle was safety and business continuity. And the second principle was servicing our current consumers. And there are over 2 million consumers which are buying from us. And we have a large cohort of baby care buyers which are associated with us. Right? And when you have a baby and you've been using certain set of products, it's an essential for you. And if some of it is not available, you get stressed, you get uncomfortable. And we wanted to ensure that these buyers who have been using our products, we are able to continue to service and provide the products to them. So we went pole to post from different government offices to police officers. I myself have not spent more time at a police station than this, right? To get all our permissions, passes, etc. going so that we can at least start servicing some of these consumers of ours. And the third thing for us was employee engagement and training. And this is the time when suddenly you're working in a new environment. Suddenly you're expected to operate in a very different manner, and hence absolutely new ways of working need to be reinvented and executed. And that is what we did, be it from moving to team management software, Slacks, etc. the world, and to setting daily, we did virtual offsites. We've been doing weekly town halls, right? Things through which we can engage and keep everyone sort of aware as well as occupied. And the second thing that we focused on was training, because this is the period where a lot of upskilling is possible, and you're not operating at peak capacity. Probably 50% of levels is what you're operating at. So a lot of people were really happy that they were getting to learn, because in the usual firefighting, you sort of end up not prioritizing that. And our fourth principle was working capital management and cash conservation. And for us as a startup, I think cash conservation is critical. And these are times when your revenues go from 100 to 0 suddenly, and while most of your fixed costs are sustained. And similarly, on cash management perspective, while you owe for what you have purchased, right, but you're not selling anymore, and hence you're not getting the cash from your customers, right? So how do you manage the cash cycle? By specifically involving your partners, your suppliers, and giving them a surety that, hey, everything is in the longer term in order. And this thing is just a small phase which will pass, and we just need to stick together and ensure that we're sort of supporting each other. And so I think that is the fourth principle that we operated with.
That's really interesting because, I mean, I think that the word cash management wasn't brought up in the other two. Of course, it's across the board, you see it. But I think what's key over here is like in the order of priority of what's top of mind for a board depends a lot about the type of organization size and scale you are. So it's not that everybody's not worried about cash and everybody's not worried about safety, but I think the key takeaway for this particular segment in terms of real outcomes is the basket of outcomes that the organization cares about may end up being the same, right? Safety, employees first, taking care of your customers, serving the community, but potentially the order in which you put out that fire changes depending on where you are in your organizational journey. I want to double click on something with all three of you that Varun said, which is around this idea of scenarios. Everything you've described right now has been reacting to a situation. But that moment of going into and having the breathing space to think about scenarios and looking forward. We will come out of this. How do you actually do scenario planning? What is the role of that? And how does that process work? What information do you need? What skills do you need to be part of scenario planning for the future? What advice do you have for the audiences who want to be more proactive now 2 months in, looking forward? And anybody can take this.
Sure. So let me sort of because this is something that we've been doing every month and sort of revisiting every week. And so from a scenario planning perspective, I think for us it's always been saying internals are in our control, right? So how much you spend on marketing, what do you open up, which channels do you focus on, which kind of consumers do you focus on, and all of those are under our control, right? But then there are certain external scenarios which are absolutely out of our control, and hence what we build on is our scenario planning largely is based on how will the external environment shape up, and depending upon how external environment will shape up, right, how will our business respond to it? And so, for example, on the external scenario, a few factors that we kept on the table is, okay, when will lockdown open up? Right? If lockdown opens up, then businesses open up, and sort of, because of that, we'll have ability to deliver. And second is, when will essential and non-essential commodity e-commerce, start operating? And third step could be, when will malls and offline stores start opening up and people will start stepping to sort of buy in, right? Now, all of these three, events might take place in different months, right? And hence, depending upon what is taking place when, right, we have got a response plan ready in terms of our marketing and in terms of our sales and in terms of our actions that we need to take from that, right? And basis that, there is a business goal that has been set in. Okay, if this happens, right, we'll be able to achieve this, right, for which we need X, Y, Z budget. Right? If this plus this happens, right, we'll actually be able to achieve higher. If this plus this happens, right, then we'll be able to achieve way beyond. Right? And actually, that's a great time to go aggressive and even gain share rather than being conservative. Right? So I think that's how we approach the whole scenario planning exercise.
So it's interesting, in the conversation of real outcomes, there's actually multiple real outcomes, and all are real depending on what comes out, which is different, right? Because it's almost like we come from a world where someone tells us, like, okay, growth rates, at least, we're going through that. Growth rate needs to be X. That's what the street says. That's what the numbers add up to. And now you're saying no one else defines that other than these external things that nobody's, but setting up multiple outcomes. Any other additions? I think, Darren, you wanted to add something.
So I think, like you said, the situation is quite fluid as of right now. You have multiple stats floating around, GDP whoops to X number, Y number. But I think it's good to be prepared. So we've broken our scenarios from the financial replanning to the marketing replanning to repivoting our business into 4 phases, right? One is during the COVID times itself, right? How can we reinvent ourselves and create new business models? Fortunately, we have multiple vertical and businesses, so we very aggressively started seeing synergies across them. I mean, can we have the cars ecosystem work more proactively with the publisher ecosystem? And there are some specific business models we've already evaluated around that. I won't get into the details, but how do we see synergies across the businesses? So while we do get back to the normal of our exit averages, which would have been March, maybe 6 months from now, anybody's guess in this room, can we create new business lines which are not that heavy on our bottom line, in the sense it's not man intensive, infrastructure intensive, but it's just about synergies between businesses. I mean, can the cars ecosystem work with the advertising ecosystem and create an inventory that is ATL, BATL, and all our physical Cashmere car stores? Can the real estate ecosystem start thinking about distressed properties and tying up with banks that they're still investors in the market who are looking for deals? There's a flip side of an investing in the real estate market where say that I can get discounted properties. So we are reinventing and looking at models to be prepared when we hit the ground running to create exponential and parallel revenue lines.
Wow.
So I think that's our remodeling that we're looking at right now. And we have these think tanks within the businesses. So each business pivots to a new revenue line. So there are 4 businesses and create an extra layer that we can have as we actually enter the cure phase. So I call it the cure phase, and then there'll be the vaccine phase, and then we get to the new normal, right? So yeah. I think that's how we're trying to plan around it. It's financial remodeling, it's new business lines, and how do we message back in the market? We can't be making sanitizers, we can't. So we have to think between the synergies of a business, right?
Yeah, I mean, what's amazing is that it's only in times of crisis that business lines that would otherwise be happy working in silos because it's going fine. Sometimes necessity is sort of the mother of all invention, right? So this idea of new business opportunities, has done that. Karthi, just a question on that. You had brought up at the beginning about digitization, right? And we've had a moment like this a few years ago with demonetization, which was that moment where, out of necessity. What's different about this time versus then, and the role of, you brought up education of the market. Is it different, or is it just another wave of the same?
I think it's more like the second for some parts of our business. So demonetization actually gave us, effectively, it was the trailer to this movie in some senses of the word for our industry. So on the back of demonetization, we geared up very quickly to become aggressively digital. So it's only after demonetization that we launched a product where a customer could go from start to finish to acquire a full-fledged bank account completely online and remote. And what we are seeing now is that those investments that we put in place in the year after demon in early 2017 are paying rich dividend, because today, when I'm unable to send a salesperson to meet a customer physically to process his or her account opening, the accounts are still pouring in, and they're pouring in at roughly the same clip as they were at peacetime. So that's on the one hand. On the other, however, on the lending side, things are quite likely to be trickier, and we are likely to learn completely new lessons. And it's in that context that I think it's rather unfortunate that even the oldest person living today, working whether at the board level or any senior level, hasn't been part of experiencing the Great Depression, because many of the numbers we are seeing coming out now seem like, if you had the benefit of the experience of someone who lived that time, would have been very valuable today. So we're all, I think, blind men around the elephant right now. So while scenario building is important, and I'm not dissing it whatsoever, I think the big problem we are all faced with, and I'm saying this only in the interest of reassuring all our 250 attendees, many of whom must be struggling with, what the hell am I supposed to do now? On a daily basis, I think we are all struggling with these questions. And if answers are not immediately forthcoming, it's okay. It's okay. We have to take this a day at a time, is what I would say at one level. Of course, you have to figure out a 3-month strategy and a 6-month strategy and a 2-year strategy. But there are too many balls in the air, and it's okay once in a while to feel like deer in the headlights. Perfectly okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great segue into our last part, which is, what's a key takeaway for the audience? And I know the starting point of it's okay not to get it right. There are a lot of people that are expecting you all, the board, to have the answers. So some self-empathy is probably really the need of the hour. Let me just kind of, before we open it up to a final round of questions, and there's been questions coming in on the Q&A, please continue to add those. The panelists have been answering them, and we'll take a couple. Any final takeaways or messages for the audience around this idea of board conversations and real outcomes? And it doesn't have to be about that. It can be, something that you want to give as a key takeaway or a piece of advice.
Okay, let me sort of start on with this. I think a lot of folks in our audience are from the marketing side of things, and I'll share 2 or 3 things on the marketing side that is extremely relevant in today's context, right? Especially pre and post COVID times. And one, during COVID, move focus from acquisition to engagement, and focus more on CRM, focus more on content, try and engage the community and consumers that you already have, and move focus from selling to storytelling. And this is not the time to hard sell, right? This is time to tell a story with which you can make connections which will last long, and innovate extremely aggressively, and think of how your category, your consumers' behavior is going to get impacted. Karthi, Tarun talked about some amazing initiatives where their businesses are pivoting towards innovation. And I mean, to give an example, our personal care categories used to be face care, body care, and hair care, and we're suddenly saying a new category shaping up, which is called hand care, right? Because you're going to sanitize a lot more, and you're going to wash your hands a lot more, and because of that, they're going to feel a lot drier, right? So you're going to moisturize them a lot more, and it's almost a category which is going to get created, and then we're going to ensure that over the next 3 months we focus and develop products through which we're able to cater to that category, right? So I think those 3 is critical when it comes to marketing in these times, and from all leaders and managers out there. And I think what I'd say is hold the mic and talk and be over communicate for that matter. This is the time when you should be talking a lot more than you used to, and engage and converse a lot more with people. And they're sometimes not sort of shying away from asking questions. You go ahead and sort of take that opportunity to have that chat. So all the leaders must over communicate.
Great, thank you. Taran, key takeaway for the audience?
I think so I'm kind of an internal optimist, right? So while there is a lot of negative news around, and this is a little more on the softer front that I want to give my last bit, there is a large opportunity coming our way also. I mean, with the headwinds that China faces and a manufacturing ecosystem, I think it is India's opportunity to lose as this gets behind us. And I'm quite sure that we'll have vaccine away, and the resilience that we have in a larger community as Indians and the way we work, I'm sure we'll hit the ground running. So I would say that whatever you do for your business is pivot fast and take those decisions quickly. Be prepared for the near and the coming future. As the tide turns, you should not be caught with your pants, as I must say, and be prepared for the new remodeling of the ecosystem. As we hear about EdTech, we hear about e-commerce, deliveries, people don't want to contact each other. But I believe once the vaccine is in, those models will be revisited, and we need to be prepared for that. So that's my bit of a giveaway. I'll keep positive, keep at it, repivot, rethink. It's not always top-down that all the good ideas come in, and some of my team members and colleagues are the ones with all the brilliant ideas come in. I mean, for us giving back to a contractual workforce is something that came from within the organization, not top-down. It's a great idea that we adopted, right? So some of the pivoting of new business models have also come from the team. So we would not have all the answers. It will be collaborative moving forward. Keep the head high up and be positive is what I would do.
That's great. And I think that the last 2 answers around that kind of answer Meenal's question around this idea of innovation, right? And this is where innovation comes out, and we are Indian, and this is the opportunity. There are a couple of questions in the console for you guys individually, so I'd ask you guys to take a real quick look and answer them as you go. I'd like to take one question, if that's okay. Being a part-time academic, there's a question around from Chaitanya around what are the long-term implications or feed forward for marketing educators and academics in our industry, and how do we incorporate this into the curriculum? And I will tell you that studying the current curriculum from some very astute academics for the last 20 years, this idea around talking about dynamic capabilities, which is a 1996 concept, or talking about value creation and value capture and business model innovation, all of this is in the scriptures that is known as marketing literature. It all exists. All the questions that people have is the end of globalization exists? Pankaj Ghemawat has been writing about this for 20 years, about what are the rises and falls of globalization. The question is, we're more interested in context and learning. So it's not that, and I think in the information overload of trying to have someone else give us answers, the opportunity today for all of us to ready ourselves for scenario planning, the future, real outcomes, is to go back a little bit, use the frameworks provided in the curriculum that's there, right? And actually layer on top of that sort of your own context for your industry, et cetera. It's a great time for you to use your, whether it be around childcare or essentials with children, or whether it be around staffing or the publishers that are on, or whether you're in the financial services industry, business model innovation, new value capture areas, competitive advantage, strategic positioning, all the things that were always there have become even more relevant. But you just have to put it in a current context. And it's about whether you look at it with the point of view of you're not looking for an answer, but you're actually going to create that new answer. Because like Karthi said, no one has the answer. So forgive us, forgive the board, and forgive yourselves a little bit. So with that, any final comments from the panelists? Let me just open it up.
Yeah, if I may.
Yes.
Yes. So I think brands have an opportunity and a responsibility at a time like this, which is somewhat unique. Brands have always had a role in holding consumers' hands in one form or the other. And I think a time like this, to hold your consumer's hand and to reassure her as well that things will get better, that it's going to be okay in one form or the other, without it being fluffy, kumbaya, we're on it together. I don't mean it in that somewhat lazy and fluffy way. I mean in a real sense, brands have always done this, and consumers have always used brands as in some form an impersonal or a virtual go-to person. And today, that opportunity has never been bigger than today. So we should all be examining what we can do in those contexts to hold our consumers' hands, which not because of that, but inevitably it will also pay us good dividend. But don't do it for that reason. Do it because you care about your customers.
Great. I feel like that's a great place to end. I think, thank you, Karthi. You may not be as old as the Great Depression, but I would say that, if you're looking for the wisdom, and yes, for those of you who didn't notice, these panelists are the original panelists from the original photograph of the session. They matured in the last 30 days, as they chased real outcomes. So with that, thank you all panelists, and please stay safe, and thank you for everything that you do. Back to you, Fanny.
Thank you very much, Virginia.
Thank you, Virginia, and the AdTech team. Thanks.
Bye.